We are doing all of QSI Unit 8 via distance learning, but do not panic because we've already done half of this content. So this is QSI Unit 8 Industry, but it's College Board Unit 7 Industry and Development. We did development as a part of Unit 2. So we're doing QSI Unit 8 as industry, and then we'll back up and do QSI Unit 7 as urban for the last unit. And urban is the 6th unit for College Board. All right? Yes, it's confusing. Just try to not pay attention to all the weird numbers, but know these topics 7.1 are as a part of CED Unit 7, which is the last unit in the College Board. So today we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. We're also going to talk about a little bit of review of economic sectors, and then talk about theories of industrial location, why industry is where it is. So we're continuing with our enduring understandings of industrialization. Past and present has facilitated improvements in standards of living, but it's also contributed geographically to uneven development. So we've already talked about a lot of this, these concepts when we talked about development in QSI Unit 2. So 7.1 is the Industrial Revolution and how it facilitated growth and diffusion of industrialization. Our essential knowledges today are industrialization began as a result of new technologies and was facilitated by the availability of natural resources. As it spread, it caused food supplies to increase. We already talked about this when we talked about the Industrial Revolution as the second agricultural revolution. And populations to grow. It allowed workers to seek new industrial jobs in the cities and changed class structures. So we talked about this in agriculture. The second agricultural revolution, which is parallel to the Industrial Revolution, changed the way farming happened. People were not needed out in the rural areas anymore to farm, so they moved en masse into the cities, and it changed the way our world is structured. As a global population, we continue to urbanize at a massive rate. And our final essential knowledge of 7.1 is investors and industry sought out more raw materials and new markets. Right? We've already talked a little bit about this when we talked about political. So I am in the industrial age. The industrial age requires a lot of raw goods to shove into my machines to make into products. And Europe is tiny. So as a producer of raw goods, it ran out of raw goods and looked for new places to find those raw goods. And they found those new places in Africa and in Asia. And so this caused a period of imperialism. And remember, imperialism is the giant umbrella topic. It means controlling another state in some way. And one of the types of imperialism is colonialism, which is what happened during the Industrial Revolution, where political states would go into another place and control them directly and create governments and infrastructure, etc. All right, so overview of the Industrial Revolution. The hearth was in Great Britain in the 18th century. I've seen 1750 as the start date. Around 1800, as we discovered in the population unit, that's when the population really began to climb, if you remember the Hans Rosling video. But the Industrial Revolution started in around 1750, and so it took 50 years for the changes of the Industrial Revolution to affect demography or population. As people learned to use water power and coal energy to manufacture goods, they saw a large increase in agricultural productivity, population, and wealth. Industrialization diffused throughout the world, and it reshaped everything. Everything we are is because of industrialization. And then we are going through our technological revolution right now, and it will eventually, we are in the middle of the changes, so we can't see them. So just like the Industrial Revolution, change happens gradually over time, and then suddenly everything is different. So the Industrial Revolution, as a definition, was a set of changes in technology that dramatically increased manufacturing productivity. It reshaped how people worked and how they behaved and where they lived and how they related to each other spatially. Remember the word spatial, S-P-A-T-I-A-L, is about where things are. So the spatial changes of the Industrial Revolution, just like the spatial changes of the second agricultural revolution, is spatially moving people from the rural areas to the urban areas, economically changing them from primary sector jobs to secondary sector jobs. So the Industrial Revolution again started in the mid-1700s. The quote here is, "It was like throwing a rock into a pond," right? You toss a rock into the pond, it goes bloop, and then there are ripples that go out. So the big ploop of the rock was Great Britain. And then the ripples that were going out started in England and the Netherlands, really close to Great Britain, and then eventually got to the United States and Germany and the rest of the world. Now, why did the Industrial Revolution start in England? Look at this map and see if you can figure out why. So the purple spots on this map are coal mining. So look at how much purple is in the United Kingdom. So they had a glut of coal. They had a lot of coal for how tiny that island is. And for a long time, coal and water were the only two sources of energy. So Great Britain had what it needed to start building giant factories to produce things. By the mid-1800s, it had spread to Germany and the US, as I said before. And by the early 1900s, it had reached all of Europe, Japan, and parts of China and South America. And today, most of the world is industrialized. There are pockets that aren't, but most of the world is industrialized in different levels of industrialization, of course, as per the Wallerstein world theories, right? So the core countries are industrialized, but they're post-industrial, which we will talk about in the next several topics. And then the semi-periphery countries are industrialized, and the periphery countries are starting to industrialize. All right, so on a smaller scale with individual countries, this is how diffusion happened, how the Industrial Revolution spread. First, factories were built near the sources of rivers, or sources of power, like rivers, right? So the very first factories were on rivers, and then when they discovered coal, they would build the factories near the coal deposits because it was they didn't have transportation really fixed. There were no railroads yet, so you didn't want to transport all that coal. You wanted to just mine the coal and put it into your factory. And then as they figured out more transportation routes, building roads, canals, harbors, and railroads, factories could be almost anywhere because you could mine the coal, put it in a train, and take it somewhere else to create energy to run the factory. So industrialization began near rivers and coal deposits and then diffused wherever railroads and roads and canals would take them. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, improvements in farm machinery, this is the second agricultural revolution, remember, increased agricultural productivity. This is a review of our agriculture unit. The Enclosure Acts also increased agricultural productivity. There's a reminder of the Enclosure Acts. And keep in mind, and this is, well, it's not hard to imagine, but it's something that's easy to forget. Great Britain was a developing country at one point. Right, so before the Enclosure Acts, most people in Great Britain lived kind of in a pastoral nomadic existence, right? They had small farms and their sheep and their goats and their cows, they would wander them through the countryside like pastoral nomadism in developing countries now. And then the Enclosure Acts changed that. They started building fences and hedgerows that prevented people from taking their cow anywhere their cow wanted to go. And that changed how those farmers and those pastoral nomads could make a living. And so it changed where they lived and what they did to economically earn things. So now we're seeing these types of changes in the developing countries. Pastoral nomadism, having trouble with that word today, is decreasing in our developing countries because of claims on land for factories and suburbs and other governmental things and borders. And so as those pastoral nomads have a decrease in land, we're seeing desertification, but we're also seeing a change in their lifestyle. This happened in England in the late 1700s. It happened in the United States a little bit, right? Every country in the world was once developing. So now every country in the world is all at a different stage of development. So again, in the Industrial Revolution, machine power replaced human and animal power, and when rural farms didn't need people anymore, everybody went to the cities. Not everybody. A lot of people went to the cities. So the cities grew quite a bit. This is a map that shows how much it grew. This is England before the Industrial Revolution and after. So the darker orange it is, the more populated it is, and the green is really urbanized population. So you can kind of see dark orange blobs where London is before the Industrial Revolution because it was a large city, but it grew by leaps and bounds during the Industrial Revolution, by like 5 million people in 100 years. And so you see these green spots that plop down in England where the industrial centers were. And if you go all the way back to that first map, it kind of mirrors where the coal mines were too. And so as workers worked in the factories running machines that made the textiles and other products, they also became consumers of the things they were making. So the economy starts to drive by the fact that people are employed and have money to spend. So there was an explosion in urban population. So between 1800 and 1900, London grew from 1 million people to 6 million people. And that's overwhelming. When you have that many people, you need to figure out an infrastructure to support that many people. We've talked about this briefly in other units where Manhattan, New York, let's say 1 million people live there, but during the day between 9 and 5, people come in from outside to work there. So it has an increase in population from 9 to 5 every day. So that the borough of Manhattan has to figure out how to support all of that population that's just there from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So electricity requirements, Wi-Fi requirements, internet requirements, sewage requirements, how many toilets are flushing between 9 and 5 versus how many are flushing between 6 and 8 at night when most of the people leave again. So London had to deal with all this. So suddenly there was a lot more sewage, there were a lot more animals. This is before cars, so we were still using horses and oxen to transport things, and they poop. What do you do with all that poop, right? And so pollution became really bad because everybody was burning wood or coal to heat their homes, and it was very dangerous. So in this era, we start to see the government taking control of regulating how people should live. And so the governments would build the sewers, and the governments would regulate the cemeteries, right? This is something you might not think about, but people were just burying their dead anywhere, and you can't do that in a city. Maybe you could do that in the country when there's space, but in the city you just can't do that. And so the government had to step in and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it, and this is what we're going to do. So we start to see governmental involvement in public health during this era. And then as the city grows, it was starting to grow vertically, right? Until we invented steel as a human race, buildings could not be enormously tall, right? And so skyscrapers became a reality during the Industrial Revolution, also necessitated the invention of the elevator. You could not have some of these buildings we have here in China without an elevator to take people up and down. And so this also had to be regulated. You had to make sure those buildings were safe, that they stayed up, that the sewage and the piping and the electricity was all very safe. And that the elevators were regulated so that they wouldn't just fall down the shaft and kill people. So the government starts changing to regulate the masses of people living in one place. Cities also grew horizontally, right? They spread out. This is what we do in America. We have all this space to spread out. Shenzhen can't really spread out because it's hemmed in by the ocean on one side and by the mountains on another. But think of a town like Houston, Texas. There's nothing but, well, there's ocean on one side, but on the other side it's just flat Texas land. And so Houston has been able to spread out. And London and other cities in the Industrial Revolution did the same thing. So in that top picture, you see that green ribbon. That's the Thames River, right? Because those first cities grew up by rivers, because water was very important for transportation, for food sources, for irrigation, right? So in 1806, before the Industrial Revolution really started affecting population, that's the city of London. By 1862, only 50 some years later, see how much it grew. And so I can live in the outreaches of London and still get to work somewhere else because there's transportation, right? We started having trains and cars and trucks, not by 1862, but there were streetcars in 1862 that would take you from one place to another. And so you could live farther out and transport yourself from place to place in the town. And food could also be transported from the country into the cities to feed the growing population because of improvements in transportation. But industrialization did not reach the whole world at once. Again, it started in Great Britain and then distributed itself through Europe and the United States. And so it caused, in several ways, the rise of imperialism. These European powers needed labor and raw goods to feed their machines and to provide a force to run the machines. And so they recognized the importance of controlling trading posts, so ports where they could dock a ship to refuel a ship, and then those trading ports became colonies because they saw how many raw materials were in these developing countries around the world. There's a definition again for imperialism: extending a state's political and economic power. And remember, there are several ways to do it. Now most people, most states practice imperialism economically, but in the 1800s, they practiced imperialism through colonialism. So colonies provided raw materials, sugar, cotton, food, lumber, and minerals. They also provided labor. And then they also provided markets. So the things that were made in these factories were then purchased by the people in the colonies. They provided ports where trading ships could get resupplied, and they made people richer so that people could invest in new factories and new canals and new railroads and bring infrastructure to a lot of the world. So that cartoon is the mother country. So the imperial state is the lady at the table in the tiara, and then the colonies are just bringing her things as maids serving her. So this colonization and this industrial development really caused the development gap in the world that we see today. Remember the branch line here on this map from Unit 2 in development. The industrialized countries developed first, and so every industrialized country is above that red line. It's the time when they industrialized, right? And so China is industrializing right now, but it's doing what America did 60 years ago, right? So everybody's on a different part of the timeline. So industrialization made wealthy countries even wealthier and poorer countries even poorer. And so that's really the crux of the great divide between the advanced industrialized states, or our core countries, and the rest of the underdeveloped non-industrialized states, which are our semi-periphery and periphery countries.